Let us start with our introduction. Okay, so this is useful for me to bring back the essay question. So analyze the effectiveness of the federal budget or fiscal policy in the stabilization of economic activity and the redistribution of income. So what I would do here is to define fiscal policy. And we had this in our content, but fiscal policy is defined as the way in which the government uses the budget to influence economic activity, resource allocation, and the distribution of income. With your introductions, just remember, before you start writing the rest of your essay, you need to just define the key terms. So I would define fiscal policy. Then what I would try to do is to situate the essay question into context. So if we're talking about how the government has used its budget to stabilize economic activity and how it does so to influence the distribution of income, you can't talk about that without talking about COVID right now. So I would try to link this to COVID-19. Here, I don't want you guys to make the mistake of just going into too much detail. We don't need you guys to talk about the cause and effect between COVID-19, economic activity and distribution of income. We just want to see how you guys are able to appropriate and situate the question into context. Something that I would mention is that, okay, due to the COVID-related downswing or recession, the government has had to respond with a variety of stimulus package measures and through an expansionary stance on fiscal policies. A lot of these expansionary stance has been driven by a lot of changes to discretionary spending. So we mentioned some before, right? So JobKeeper, Job Seeker, Job Trainer, changes for business spending. These are discretionary changes that the government has made in response to COVID-19. And you can use some statistics to bolster this up, but that has helped prevent a further worsening of economic growth. It's helped keep our unemployment rate as stable as can be expected. That's worth mentioning. You should also talk about distribution of income. How would you talk about distribution of income for COVID? The government spending on things like Job Seeker. Job Seeker applies to people that have lost their jobs due to COVID-19. So if you're providing unemployed people with transfer payments, that's going to increase their disposable income, and that's going to help prevent the worsening of income inequality. That's in relation to COVID-19. But if you didn't want to talk about COVID-19 and you just wanted to talk about recent trends, you could talk about the increase in healthcare spending, to talk about an increase in education spending, changes to the progressive income tax system. That's all relevant here. I would also, in this introduction, establish what I'm going to talk about in my body paragraphs. As we have in our plan here, we're going to talk about automatic stabilizers discretionary spending. So I would infer that. So I would say that, okay, the government achieves its objectives of stabilizing eco activity and redistributing income through its automatic stabilizers and changes in discretionary expenditure. And then I would say, as evident in COVID-19, the government has increased its discretionary spending into measures like Job Seeker and JobKeeper. The last part of your introduction that I would talk about is some of the limitations on the effectiveness of the budget. I know that we haven't talked about this in particular in isolation, but I thought it would sort of make more sense as we're going through the content to talk about it. So think about this here, right? In an ideal world, the government will spend what it needs based on what the economy needs. Obviously, that cannot entirely occur, and that's sort of what we have to talk about here. So if you are analyzing the effectiveness of a policy, the word analyze is implying that the policy is not perfect in the first place. I personally would talk about one of the limitations of fiscal policy in my introduction straight away. So for me, when I think about fiscal policy, some limitations that I can think of is how it's constrained by the political process. So earlier in this topic, we talked about this idea that for a policy to be enacted, it has to go through the House of Reps and the Senate first before it's actually even implemented. So because there is a degree of political constraints and political influence, the policies that end up getting passed may not necessarily be the most appropriate for what's occurring in our economy. That's the first part. The second part is that spending is not infinite. And I want you guys to backtrack all the way to topic 1 and think about this, right? So we have the economic problem. The economic problem tells us that we cannot fulfill these unlimited needs and wants because we have finite resources. The constraints of fiscal policy are much like that. Even though we'd wish to spend lots of money to help support low-income earners, to boost our economy, the government realistically cannot do that because it only has so many fiscal resources or budget money by which it can spend on different things. This way, you can bring up a concept like opportunity cost. So if the government were to invest increased funds into programs like Job Seeker and JobKeeper, which are stimulus package measures, then that's going to pose as an opportunity cost into investment into other areas of the economy. That could be education, that could be tourism, that could be national defense, it could be anything. But that's worth mentioning here. So because the government has finite fiscal resources, it has a limited way by which it can allocate its finite funds or resources, and that's going to have differing effects on them. That's what I want you guys to keep in mind. Another thing that you can talk about is time lags. It's not going to be as prominent as in monetary policy, but we know that the budget is released every May. That means that there is an implementation time lag of 1 year. So it takes 1 year for us to implement fiscal policy. That means that when there's a development in the economy, the budget might not be the most responsive tool by which we can use. In that case, we may favor the use of something like monetary policy, where we can adjust our stance more often on a month-to-month basis. You can talk about that. But you can also say that with the budget, once a policy gets passed through, the effects of that policy is virtually immediate. So I keep going back to JobKeeper and JobSeeker, but that's just because it's so topical. The moment that the government put in the JobKeeper package into play, which is how the government pays $1,500 per fortnight for a business to retain its employees. So in light of that policy, as soon as that passed through, businesses were applying to the government to receive that JobKeeper payment, and automatically you saw the reduction, or I guess the control of the unemployment rate due to that policy. That's where I'm coming from here about fiscal policy being relatively immediate in terms of its impacts. So that's sort of just our brief overview. What I want to bring up here as well is how well you do in essay questions is going to come from your ability to link between the different topics of the course. We're up to topic 6, which suggests that everything that you've learned from topics 1 to 6 is all assumed knowledge now. If you're able to integrate in ideas like opportunity cost, the economic problem, monopoly power, derived demand for labor, those concepts from earlier on, and seamlessly link it into your discussion, that's going to ensure that you do better in your essay questions. That's sort of one of the secrets to doing well. A lot of kids will just look at this and think, okay, so I'm going to talk about tax, I'm going to talk about automatic stabilizers, I'm going to talk about the areas of government expenditure without linking it to other parts of the course. And you want to be trying to do that. So defining fiscal policy, this is the use of the federal budget in influencing 3 things, right? So the first one is going to be stabilizing economic activity. It's going to have an influence in resource allocation, and lastly, distribution of income. Some terminology that I'd like you guys to try to bring in here is this idea of budget instruments. So our 2 budget instruments are taxation, revenue, and government expenditure, but that's a really nice sort of way of packaging it. We can also talk about the fact that fiscal policy is a counter-cyclical policy, or you could also call it an economic stabilization policy. This shouldn't be too new to you guys, but fiscal policy is a macroeconomic policy. What that means is that it's influencing aggregate demand. So what's occurring with aggregate demand can be best reflected through the business cycle. So if we're saying that fiscal policy is a counter-cyclical policy, we're going to expect that during times of economic upswing, the government's going to try to ameliorate the extremities of the business cycle. So if we're experiencing a peak, the goal of counter-cyclical fiscal policy would be to try to bring down some of that economic growth to prevent our economy from overheating. By converse, if we're experiencing a recession, like a COVID-related recession, then we're going to want to try to bring up this trough via counter-cyclical policy.